And now, marine weather around Alaska.
Starting off the marine segment here with tonight's weather. Front out here over the Bering Sea, pretty much stationary there and slowly weakening, still close enough to keep a chance of some light snow along the southwest coast here, and precipitation as the moisture links up with this system down to the south. So periods of rain, Kodiak Island, chance of rain, southern Kenai Peninsula there, and improving out toward the eastern and central Aleutians. The interior, another clear, chilly night here, central and east side, a little bit milder here in the west. Gusty northeast winds over northern part of the southeast coast, and then more clouds and a risk of a shower down to the south. Then for tomorrow, this front really not moving too much. If anything, starting to pull back to the west a little bit, but still close enough for maybe a few skiffs of light snow along the southwest coast there. Light rain in the Pribilofs, light rain here on Alaska Island, developing into a steadier, a little bit heavier rain for the Alaska Peninsula with this front that's coming northward. Winds also increase here with rainfall rates over Kodiak Island. That extends up across the Barren Islands, possibly into Kamishak Bay. Otherwise, mostly clear and quiet over all of interior Alaska from the Arctic coast all the way down into the Panhandle here. Arctic high over the Yukon there, producing gusty northeast winds there, especially through the channeled areas of the northern Panhandle, and a risk of some shower activity with mostly cloudy skies down to the south. And then actually out here to the west, another system out here brings some more rain into the Aleutians, and that just kind of weakens into a front right through here rapidly as another system comes onto the chart there. This low keeps it wet and a little breezy for the eastern Aleutians Alaska Peninsula, and showers Kodiak Island. Fair in the interior, another quiet day coming up for the areas from the Arctic coast all the way down. Maybe an increase in the clouds here over southern Alaska, but not too bad. Still windy, but slowly diminishing there for Lynn Canal, and dry for the remainder of the southeast coast. For tomorrow, pretty brisk here on the south coast. Actually, the entire coast looking pretty windy tomorrow. East winds 30 to 35 knots, south coast, central coast about the same, east at 30 knots, and northeast 25 to 30 knots for the north coast. Gale warnings in Lynn Canal, north 35 knots, and north 30 knots, gusting 50 knots there for Stevens Passage, with southeast winds at 20 knots for Clarence Strait. Then on Wednesday, north winds 30 knots here over the northern and central inside waters, north at 20 for Clarence Strait, and east winds at 20 to 20 or 25 to 30 knots here for the entire coastline. And for Prince William Sound, northeast at 15 for the day tomorrow, and east-northeast at 25 to 30 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast, but good gales here for the western North Gulf Coast, northeast 40 knots, and full gales for the Barren Islands and Kamishak Bay, east-northeasterlies there at 45 knots. Windier day for Cook Inlet tomorrow in the forecast, northeast winds 30 to 35 knots. And then for Wednesday, northeast 20 to 30 for Cook Inlet. And then here for the Barren Islands, Kamishak Bay, and western North Gulf Coast, still looking at gale warnings of 35 to 40 knots for the wind speeds, and east at 25 to 30 knots for the eastern North Gulf Coast. Prince William Sound, northeast winds 15 knots. And very windy conditions there for the Kodiak Island area for east winds 45 to 50 knots with the storm force winds forecast to be in Shelikof Strait. Otherwise, north to northeast winds 25 to 35 knots for the Alaska Peninsula. Gale warnings for Bristol Bay. East winds 35 knots, seas 8 feet. 25 knot winds out of the northeast for Bristol Bay there for for Wednesday. And the Alaska Peninsula, east winds 30 knots. Kodiak Island, east to northeast winds 25 to 35 knots. And for the eastern Aleutians, north to northwest winds 15 to 30 knots, east winds 20 to 25 knots for the central Aleutians, and farther to the west, actually from Amchitka Island to Shimianatu, looking at 25 knot winds with seas running as high as 14 feet. And then for the day on Wednesday, east to southeast winds at 30 to 45 knots for the western Aleutians, north at 25 knots for Adak and Atka. And for the eastern Aleutians, north to northeast winds, 25 to 30 knots. And then for the southwest coast here for New Year's Eve, east winds 25 to 30 knots, about the same for St. Lawrence Island and Norton Sound. Pribilof's northwest at 20 knots and east at 30 knots for St. Matthew Island. Then on Wednesday, northeast winds 20 to 25 knots here for the southwest coast. St. Lawrence Island, those northeast winds coming down to 15 knots and about 20 knots there in Norton Sound. Small craft advisories for St. Matthew, St. Paul, and St. George Islands for northeasterlies at 25. And for the eastern and central Beaufort Sea coast tomorrow, east to northeast winds 20 knots. East winds 25 knots there for the western Arctic coast. And for the Chukchi Sea, east to northeast winds 15 to 20 knots. Moving ahead, first day of the year, Wednesday, east to northeast winds at 10 to 25 knots for the Chukchi Sea. First wind advisories, western Arctic coast, east at 30 knots. And for the central and eastern Beaufort Sea coast, east to northeast winds, 20 knots.